The barbecue, sorry.
No.
The barbecue.
Please.
Reminding me, I thought a sentence at the far end is the barbecue that is pending, and if you can upstairs get plates and cutlery and such to bring to that would be great.
Yes. I'm the last presentation, so it's just me between you and the food and drink, so that's exciting. I will try to keep the last talk of the day kind of exciting and visual for you. So as Terry mentioned, my name is Maggie Low, and I want to thank all of you for sticking around and being here today. I do want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and I'm very thankful to be a guest on this land. And I am a member of Wikwemikong First Nation on Manitoulin Island in Northern Ontario. And the title of my talk today is Indigenous Governance and the Reconciliation Protocol Agreement Implications for Heiltsuk Nation. And again, as Terry mentioned, I'm in the thick of writing my data chapters. So today I'm going to share with you some of my experiences and findings from the research that I did with the Heiltsuk Integrated Resource Management Department over the last 2 years in Bella Bella. So I'll get to that stuff, the juicy parts, soon. But first, I'm going to there we go. Just get into a little bit of context. So as most of you probably know, there's an important and broken relationship that exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. So my research explores this relationship through governance and authority over land. And specifically, it looks at how new protocol and reconciliation agreements negotiated between several First Nations governments and the BC government are playing out in practice and on the land, and how it's changing the relationship between these two governments in very important ways. So just to start off a little bit more broadly, we've been hearing much more about rebuilding a new relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in recent years, especially with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which conducted a multi-year investigation into the atrocities of the residential school system, and which also released their 91 calls to action to advance the process of reconciliation. And we do know that much of the tension between Indigenous governments and the Crown remains over land and resources. So questions like who has jurisdiction over the land, who benefits from the land and the resources, and who takes care of that land. And of course, these questions are particularly complex in this province because there are very few historic treaties that have been signed between First Nations and the BC government. And Indigenous peoples across Canada, and definitely here in BC, have never stopped fighting for their Aboriginal rights, interests, and title to their lands. And many of these battles have played out in courts. Since the 1970s, the Supreme Court of Canada has consistently ruled in favor of First Nations seeking to exercise their rights over their territories. So, for example, we have the Calder case in 1973, which was the first court decision to acknowledge the very existence of Aboriginal rights, including the fact that Aboriginal title to traditional territory is even a thing. And the most recent landmark decision about title, maybe not the most recent, but a recent one, has been the Chilcotin decision in 2014, where the courts actually declared Aboriginal title to some of the Chilcotin lands in the interior of now what we know as BC. And it has been well established in literature and in practice that these legal victories for First Nations are forcing other levels of government to rethink their relationship with First Nations and to include nations in decision-making affecting their territories. But while First Nations are certainly seeing the benefits of these legal victories in terms of increasing authority over their lands, court battles actually take a lot of time and they take a lot of resources. There are lots of other strategies at play in the larger picture of how First Nations and their governments assert their authority over their land, and they take care of their lands. So instead of only title cases, several nations have taken the path of negotiation, and this is the area in which my research falls. So let's talk about that a little bit. So within the last 10 years or so, legally binding protocol agreements have been negotiated and signed between the BC government and several First Nations governments along the north and central coast of the province. And they've been negotiated as an attempt to address conflicts over land and to begin to build a more respectful relationship. So my work focuses on the governance implications of one of these agreements called the Reconciliation Protocol Agreement, which for the rest of this talk I'll most likely refer to as the RPA. And so this agreement, the RPA, was negotiated between Coastal First Nations, which is a political entity representing several First Nations on the North and Central Coast, and the BC government. And Celtic Nation, who I worked closely with, was one of the signatory nations of this agreement, and the community was brought back to Celtic leadership and the community, and it was ratified in early 2010. So just a little bit about the Celtic. The Celtic Nation's territory encompasses 16,000 square kilometers of land and waterways on BC's central coast. You can see Bella Bella from the air here. Bella Bella is Celtic's main reserve, and it is only accessible by ferry, boat, and plane. And the Celtic have never surrendered their rights to their territory nor their duty to look after it. And they've occupied their territory since time immemorial and practice a system of governance based on hereditary chieftainship that is continuous from pre-1846 through to today. And I'll speak more about this governance system in just a few minutes. But today, the Celtic Integrated Resource Management Department is the government department responsible for stewardship in Celtic territory. This is their offices in Bella Bella. 2 years ago, I approached the department to ask if they had any research questions that they needed answered, and they responded by asking me to investigate how the Reconciliation Protocol Agreement that they signed in 2010 had impacted their governance and benefited their communities. So they wanted to know how it was working in practice, what were the good things and maybe not the good things. So I set out to do this research. And by living in Bella Bella for just over a year, and I conducted interviews with staff, elected leaders, and interviewed resource managers from other nations on the coast. I also attended several community events and meetings and ceremonies, and I was really lucky and was able to get out on the land and water quite a bit. So what is the Reconciliation Protocol Agreement exactly? It's a 28-page document, and I will not go through all of it. Get a little bit dry. So it is vast in scope, and essentially it's an agreement on the part of both the Celtic government and the BC government to work more collaboratively together on land use and resource decision making in Celtic territory. It also focuses on advancing economic opportunities for the community through tourism, forestry, and clean energy initiatives. So, for example, in this agreement, Celtic negotiated a significant increase in their replaceable and non-replaceable forest tenures, and Celtic have exercised the agreement to create better working relationships with the major forestry companies operating in their territory through well-established memorandums of understanding between Celtic and each company. They've also agreed to a new and hopefully more effective shared decision-making process with the province of BC called the Engagement Framework. So these are just a couple of the things that are encompassed and are specific to Celtic. So when I began this work, I have to admit that I was hesitant about the impact of an agreement like this for Celtic Nation. However, I did quickly come to realize that the RPA has been an important and strategic tool for the nation, and it has had tangible governance benefits. And I will speak to these benefits in more detail. But then I'm going to talk to you about what kind of excited me most about this research in terms of the strength of Celtic governance and how it might speak to the larger picture of Indigenous authority over their territories and sovereignty. So to get into the RPA a little bit more, a practical example of how the RPA has been used strategically is it helped the Celtic Tribal Council, so that's the name of the Celtic government, to create the Celtic Integrated Resource Management Department itself. So over the last 7 to 8 years, Celtic staff, many of whom are HERM staff, many of whom are Celtic, have been responsible for implementing the several elements of the RPA, as well as other agreements that have been born out of the RPA within the last 7 years. And HERM is certainly growing its institutional capacity to use the RPA to exercise jurisdiction within their territory, most notably through forestry, referrals, and GIS. So also, hopefully you don't get too bogged down by the writing on this, it's just to show that Haltzik are strategically using the RPA to not only get them to the negotiating table, but also force the BC government and resource users to address their rights and interests in a more meaningful way. An example of this is the fact that the initial RPA has recently gone through a review process by all the parties and has been amended to address many of the gaps and shortcomings of the first RPA in 2010. And again, from this screenshot, we see that the Haltzik have actually negotiated a reconciliation agreement with the Government of Canada, which was recently announced in January 2000, or just this past January. So just a little snippet of my data. Here's a great quote from an elected leader to exemplify how the RPA has impacted Haltzik's influence in decision making as a level of government. So I'll just read it out. I think being able to move from always a position of being outside or not at the table to having a voice at that table for things rightly that are happening within our territory. We ought to have the strongest voices around these issues. So being able to have this type of agreement sets that table for government-to-government discussions and not being on the outside looking in. So in many ways, the RPA has really charged the way Haltzik have asserted authority over their territory. But I am very careful not to glorify the Reconciliation Protocol Agreement, as it is certainly not the only way Haltzik assert their jurisdiction and authority. And this is what has become the most important learning I have done in this work, and something I'd like to finish my talk off with. So while the Haltzik have negotiated agreements such as the RPA to help give them a stronger voice at the table, conflict over land and resources obviously still persist, and the Haltzik have used other means to achieve their resource and governance goals. So, get into those a little bit. So, for example, some of you might recall or have heard of Haltzik being in the news over the last few years, especially when the Department of Fisheries and Oceans opened Haltzik territory to the commercial herring fishery. So this prompted immediate frustration by the Haltzik, who depend upon and harvest herring roe for their food and ceremony, but also it's very important to their economy. So after a peaceful yet effective occupation of the local DFO office in Shearwater, Vancouver and Victoria, Haltzik leaders negotiated a joint herring management plan that is being used by the commercial and Haltzik herring fishery on the water today as we speak. And just a side note, a story, within the first 2 weeks of me moving up to Bella Bella, I actually was there the day that the Haltzik occupied the DFO offices, and so that was kind of my introduction to living in Bella Bella, and I kind of saw that whole process unfold over the last 2 years to now. I hear HERM staff on conference calls and on the phone with high ups at DFO, so it was kind of cool to watch that process unfold. So the most important part of the story for me is the fact that Haltzik have maintained their hereditary governance system, and they've been asserting rights over their territory since time immemorial through their hereditary laws called Gwilas. So, that's not what I wanted to do. So the word that I just said is spelled right here. And you can, and in English, this word, it's a Haltzik word, in English it means our governing authority over all matters related to our lands and people. So one way in which Haltzik use their Gwilas, and there are many ways that they use it, is through their land use plan, and this is a photo of the first page of their land use plan and declaration, which they developed to lay out a vision for how they will protect their resources for their survival and well-being. And Haltzik have exercised their land use plan as a mandate, or used it as a mandate for negotiations around land use decisions. Another poignant example of Haltzik asserting their authority through their hereditary governance is their recent Haltzik title and rights strategy. So this is also a declaration within that strategy. This comprehensive strategy received considerable input from the community and is supported by the HEMAS Council. So the HEMAS Council is the Council of Hereditary Chiefs that works very, very closely with the elected leadership. And the objective of the Haltzik's title and rights strategy is, and I quote, to obtain a declaration of title to our lands and waters and exercise jurisdiction and maximum control over our territory, end quote. So while this might just seem like words on paper, it actually holds a great deal of significance for Celtic Nation as they move forward. While the strategy mentions the RPA and the herring management plan as part of its inception, the strategy is based on Celtic's hereditary laws and inherent jurisdiction. And this title and rights strategy is exercised in negotiations and also when dealing with other conflicts that arise. For example, some of you might have heard the recent sinking of the Nathan E. Stewart tugboat in Celtic waters this past October. I'm happy to talk about that further if you have questions. So even though my research began with exploring the governance implications of the Reconciliation Protocol Agreement, and we concluded that it was a good thing, the real story for me, and hopefully for you, is that there's a very real coexistence of two distinct levels of governing happening here. And this is something we must all pay attention to in the larger picture of relationship building. And this all kind of culminated for me this past fall. It was kind of a moment when I was back in Bella Bella in September, the end of September, for the royal visit. So we're just going to depict this photo just a little bit. So here we have the crown. Oops, sorry. Here we have the crown in the very real sense of the word. So we have the royal couple, and we have the province of BC, represented by Christy Clark. We have the federal government, represented by Jody Wilson-Raybould, and we have the Celtic government. The man standing in front has the responsibility of speaking for the head chief of the Celtic nation, whose name is Wela. And it's important to see that this address is taking place in the presence of other hereditary chiefs. They're sitting behind and standing as well. Also taking place in the presence of ladies of high ranking, and it's taking place in front of the community, visitors, allies, media, and they're all witnessing this important address in business. And the address that he is making is not just for show or for costume. It's real and it's profound, and he's welcoming the crown to Celtic territory and reminding them of Celtic jurisdiction and sovereignty. And this address is where some real power for the Celtic comes from. So to bring this back to the RPA, while much is being achieved at the higher governance level, much of the success remains unseen or felt by the community. And this is something that those who negotiated and implement the RPA do struggle with. So in terms of Celtic well-being, it's clear that work remains in translating the governance gains of the RPA and its subsequent agreements and initiatives into tangible benefits. But to leave you on a more positive note, and that ties all of this together, through the 2016 RPA amendments and some very savvy negotiation skills on the part of HERM's staff, the Celtic have secured the resources they need to build a big house, where they will not only practice their culture, but exercise their governance authority and root their people. And this big house is a huge part of Celtic well-being. So while protocol agreements are not necessarily workable for all nations, I really want to make that clear. There's different contexts across the province and across the country. In recent years, it is interesting to know that in recent years, more protocol agreements have been signed, and I do expect this will continue into the future. So before I wrap up, and I am almost done, I just wanted to thank all of the amazing, incredible folks at the Celtic Integrated Resource Management Department, Celtic Tribal Council, Coastal First Nations, Newhalk Nation, Kitasoo Hay-Hace, as well as all my funders, UBC Public Scholars Initiative, SHIRK, UBC, and the Wikwemekong Board of Education. And so just to wrap up, there's certainly a lot going on in Celtic territory and up and down the coast. My research that began with exploring the implications of emerging protocol and reconciliation agreements has revealed much more to me about the deeper complexities of Indigenous governance and truly exemplified the reassertion of authority of First Nations in BC over their territory. And there is power in that. There's power in this that should not and cannot be ignored by other levels of government, nor the rest of Canadians, as we move forward in this new era of relationship building and reconciliation. Thank you very much.
Question for Maggie?
Johnny?
So, you have two very different perspectives of what reconciliation is. Very different ways of talking about this.
Mm-hmm.
Doug's been talking about institutions and independence, democratic, governments, right? They utilize the same tools, technologies to go about engaging in with science, etc. Right? And it's right? So the efficiency of the camp. So, but they have different outcomes. You know, use the science and technology, right? And that's where the conflict comes in. Right? The health safety. You know, that you have like a liberal democratic government and say, oh, we're just going to fish this no matter what. Whereas you have like an indigenous government saying, we're going to hold the nets, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
how do you see reconciliation come about in this kind of process where conflict might be to the relationship between
It's a
Try to synthesize my question for you.
how do I see, oh God, how do I see reconciliation coming about kind of with these two systems, the tension between the two systems? Well, it's an excellent question, and I think we're going to see, I mean, really, I'm not sure yet. And in terms of conflict being involved, I think that's a big part of it, and it's going to continue to be a big part of it. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because out of it are becoming more and more of these types of, whether it's a reconciliation protocol agreement, which again I'm not trying to say is it, because it's certainly not, but there are processes and conversations and discussions and things happening out of this conflict that I think that are important and kind of part of the reconciliation journey. And yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah. There you go. Yeah? Yeah. I can try to the best of my knowledge. I can. So yes, there is the band. So the Celtic Tribal Council is the band council, and it's the kind of democratically elected government. And it's, so there's councillors, and then there's the chief councillor, Marilyn Slett, and they were elected by the membership. And that system is very much was imposed onto the Celtic Nation through the Indian Act a very long time ago. But that was a new way of governing that was imposed on them. But as I mentioned in the presentation, before that, the Celtic had ways of governing, and that exists still today. And so one example of that is the HEMAS Council that I mentioned, but there's the HEMAS Council that is made up of hereditary chiefs. And so the HEMAS Council and HTC, the Celtic Tribal Council, actually have a written MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, and they work together to make major decisions about their territory. And I'm actually not sure about on-reserve issues, but about very major decisions they do. Yeah, so they work together very, very closely, and in some way, and in some instances, from my understanding, like the HEMAS Council really have a lot of say and power. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, Terry? Or, yeah. Yeah, so it's an excellent question. So we have the Celtic Tribal Council, and then we have in one building, and then there's the Celtic Integrated Resource Management Department, and they have their own building that's separate, and they consider themselves, they call themselves the stewardship arm of the Celtic Nation, and they are part of HTC. But HTC deals with a lot of different issues. A lot of that stuff that they deal with is on reserve. So housing, waste management, that type of stuff. And it's interesting, this is what came up in my interview. So the Celtic wanted kind of a group, like a body, to be able to deal with their territory. So what was happening on the water and the land, and the solution they came up with, and also like incongruently what was happening was that they were receiving money through other agreements that they had signed and carbon credits. They came up with, they had a think tank, they called it, and they came up with actually creating another body that would be specifically responsible for asserting authority over the territory itself. And so some of the concrete ways that they do this, so all of the referrals that come in from mainly forest companies for Celtic, but all of the referrals that come in go through the HERMD office. And HTC, I mean, they sign off on them, but all of the work is done within that office. A lot of the work done around, and the RPA doesn't really touch marine issues specifically, but all the work done with DFO as well happens in the HERMD office. Yeah. Keely? So do you mean, that's a really good question. Do you mean like other nations? Like how can other nations learn from this example? Or like from what's happened here? Or?
I guess I just think is the Celtic Nation a special case that they already were so having power to the authority, or are they going to be other nations in similar positions go on?
Yeah, I mean, they are a special case in that they do have quite a bit of capacity within their community, and they have for a long time that have been like watching and have been part of, like we're part of treaty negotiations when treaty was a thing. It's not anymore, but for Celtic anyway, that kind of kept this process moving along in Bella Bella. And I do think that's happened in other communities as well along the coast. I can't speak specifically as to how that happened in those communities, but I know it definitely has. But interestingly, like through my interview data, when what kept coming up is, there are elected leaders within Bella Bella that can be definitely critical of these types of agreements, and she kept kind of saying, well, yeah, it's okay, but it's not good for this and this and this. But when she's out in the, like outside of Bella Bella and at conferences or meeting other Indigenous people will come up to her and be like, oh my God, like how did you negotiate this agreement? How did you do it? Like we want what you have. And she kind of she's like, oh, right, okay, I guess it is a good thing. So that seems to be happening more and more. Yeah. Yeah.
Does the RPA anywhere, I've heard this before, I'm sure you've heard it, does it in any way prohibit the from the
No, not, do you mean like, does it like restrict, like do they have, sorry?
like industrial commercial activities that the government because they're engaged in RPA and the government aspects of that agreement kind of limit their ability to resist those activities?
To the best of my knowledge, no. The whole point of this type of agreement was to kind of get away from that and try to have the two levels of government work more collaboratively together. And it doesn't, like this agreement doesn't take away from Haltzik asserting their rights over the land. Like there's even language within these agreements that say, you know, the Crown recognizes that Haltzik asserts their authority, like their jurisdiction over this land, which is pretty big in itself. But yeah, it doesn't extinguish any rights. It doesn't do anything like that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Maggie and all the other speakers for a really great